Picture this: a concentration camp filled with fear, desperation, and unimaginable horrors, where the lives of the prisoners are in the hands of those who have no mercy. Among these perpetrators were women, female guards who had the power to control, punish, and decide the fate of thousands. But what happened to these women, who played a key role in the brutality of the Holocaust? How did the story of their cruelty come to a close? In this video, we'll uncover the disturbing history of Stutthof concentration camp, the female guards who terrorized it, and the brutal executions they ultimately faced. Stick with us until the end to learn about this chilling chapter of history and the consequences these women ultimately paid for their actions. The Holocaust is one of the darkest periods in human history, filled with atrocities that defy comprehension. Among the many places of torment across Nazi-occupied Europe, Stutthof concentration camp stands as a reminder of the brutality that took place. Stutthof was one of the first camps set up by the Nazis when they invaded Poland in 1939. Initially, it was used to house Polish political prisoners, but it quickly expanded its scope to include Jews, Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others who were considered undesirable by the Nazi regime. As the war raged on, the camp grew increasingly overcrowded, and its conditions worsened. Prisoners endured forced labor, starvation, disease, and random executions. But in this terrifying environment, there was another source of suffering: the camp's female guards. While the male officers often received the most attention, it's crucial not to overlook the women, who were also responsible for some of the most brutal acts committed within the camp's walls. These female guards were not passive figures, merely following orders. Many of them were active participants in the torture and death of prisoners. Their roles were varied. Some worked directly in overseeing forced labor, while others managed the camp's daily routines. However, what they all shared was an unwavering allegiance to the Nazi regime and an unwavering commitment to enforcing the camp's brutal system. Some of these women were tasked with overseeing the forced labor details, where prisoners worked in grueling conditions, often for hours on end with little rest. Any attempt to slow down or show signs of weakness would result in harsh punishment. These guards were feared by the prisoners for their cruelty. For example, Helga P., a notorious female guard at Stutthof, had a reputation for being merciless. She would frequently punish prisoners for the slightest of infractions. Helga enjoyed the power she had over the people in her care, and many survivors later described her as sadistic and unforgiving. Another infamous figure at Stutthof was Elsbeth, a woman who carried out the orders of her superiors without hesitation. Her job was to maintain order in the barracks, and she did so with terrifying efficiency. She had no regard for the well-being of the prisoners, regularly subjecting them to abuse. Elsbeth was notorious for her cruelty, and she played a significant role in the deaths of many prisoners through her harsh treatment and her direct involvement in executions. These women were not just following orders. Many of them were eager to participate in the violence. The brutality of the camp wasn't simply about enforcing the Nazis' policies. It was also about maintaining a system of fear, terror, and death. The women of Stutthof were deeply involved in this system, and they participated in it willingly, without remorse. The female guards did more than just supervise prisoners. They were also directly involved in the executions that took place at Stutthof. It was a common practice for prisoners to be executed by shooting or by being sent to gas chambers. The women would often assist in leading prisoners to their deaths, sometimes even watching with cold indifference as the killings occurred. These executions were not always carried out in secret. Sometimes they took place in full view of the other prisoners, further enforcing the sense of hopelessness and fear that permeated the camp. But as the war drew to a close and the Allies began to advance, the once feared female guards found themselves in a very different situation. The Nazi regime was falling apart, and many of the camp staff realized that they would soon face justice for their actions. As Soviet forces approached Stutthof in 1945, the Nazis began evacuating the camp, taking many of the guard with them as they fled westward in an attempt to escape the coming retribution. The female guards, like their male counterparts, thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. Some attempted to blend in with the retreating troops, while others simply fled into the surrounding countryside. But despite their efforts to run, history caught up with them. The collapse of the Nazi regime meant that those responsible for the atrocities of the Holocaust could no longer hide. After the war, As the Allies and other governments worked to bring the perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice, many of the female guards at Stutthof were tracked down and arrested. The trials that followed were some of the most significant moments in post-war history, as they gave the world a chance to confront the horrific crimes that had taken place in the concentration camps. The female guards were among those put on trial for their war crimes. The women tried to defend themselves, often claiming that they were just following orders or that they had been forced into their roles. However, their defense was not accepted by the courts. The world saw through their excuses and held them accountable for the immense suffering they had caused. The trials were not simply about bringing the guilty to justice. They were about sending a message to the world that no one, regardless of the position, would escape the consequences of such cruelty. Many of the women who served as guards at Stutthof were convicted and sentenced to prison. Some were even given the death penalty. The most notorious of them, those whose cruelty had been the most extreme, were executed. Their death served as a grim reminder of the price of their actions. It was a harsh but necessary form of justice, ensuring that those who had been so willing to inflict suffering were not allowed to escape the consequences of their cruelty. The executions of these women were also a reflection of the larger reckoning that was taking place in Europe. As the world tried to understand the full scope of the Holocaust and the magnitude of the crimes committed, it became clear that those who had supported the Nazi regime, whether through active participation or blind obedience, were all complicit in the suffering of millions. The trials and executions were a way of holding these individuals accountable for their roles in one of the most horrific genocides in history. As we examine the role of female guards at Stutthof, it's crucial to understand how the camp itself operated and the broader context within which these women operated. Stutthof wasn't just a place where prisoners were held. It was a brutal factory of suffering. Prisoners were subjected to horrific living conditions, forced to work in inhumane circumstances, and often subjected to random acts of violence. The female guards who worked at the camp were a central part of ensuring the system of oppression functioned efficiently. In the early stages of Stutthof's existence, many of the camp's leaders were male. However, as the war progressed and the demand for guards increased, women were increasingly recruited to help manage the camp. These women were typically young, often from Nazi-occupied territories, and were sometimes former civilians with no previous military experience. Many of them, as was common under the Nazi regime, were indoctrinated with the regime's anti-Semitic and militaristic ideologies, which made it easier for them to justify their role in the atrocities. These female guards were often given positions of authority within the camp, and their duties extended beyond simple supervision. They had the power to manage prisoners, allocate labor, and even decide the fate of those who disobeyed the harsh camp rules. The role of female guards in overseeing labor details was particularly significant. Prisoners who were not productive enough or who were deemed too weak to work would be singled out and either tortured or executed. Female guards participated in this system of brutal control with little hesitation. Their actions were not merely the result of obedience to orders. Many showed an active enthusiasm for the power they held over prisoners. Furthermore, many of these female guards lived in a culture that upheld a deeply rooted sense of superiority. The Nazi regime, in promoting the ideology of racial purity, often emphasized that their members were part of an elite racial group. This belief in racial superiority created a sense of entitlement among those who served in the camps. Female guards, indoctrinated into this belief, viewed themselves as members of the superior race, often treating the prisoners as subhuman. This sense of superiority enabled many female guards to commit their brutal acts without remorse. They viewed the prisoners, especially the Jews, as less than human, and therefore justifying a violent treatment was something that came easily to them. They would regularly beat, humiliate, and sometimes execute prisoners with no real fear of punishment. It was not unusual for these guards to boast about the violence they inflicted or to gain pleasure from causing suffering. Some survivors of Stutthof recall how certain female guards would take pleasure in watching the executions and humiliations of the prisoners. In many cases, these women were even more brutal than their male counterparts. While male officers often oversaw the killings and executions, the women worked closely with prisoners, and it was in these interactions that they could be seen at their most cruel. The female guards had a disturbing capacity to separate themselves emotionally from brutality they carried out. They were able to view their actions as just part of their job, a duty they were tasked with, and thus many became desensitized to the suffering they were inflicting. It is also important to consider the psychological toll that the role of a guard in a concentration camp, like Stutthof, had on the women. These women were not merely carrying out orders. They were participating in a system that required them to abandon all notions of compassion or humanity. As the war dragged on, the women found themselves entrenched in the system of cruelty, which became more extreme as the war neared its end. At the same time, the brutality of the regime they served under began to take its toll on their psyche as well. After the war, many of these women had to confront their actions. Some tried to claim ignorance, asserting that they were simply following orders or that they were too young to understand the consequences of their involvement. But these defenses were not widely accepted. The trials after the war showed that the female guards, like their male counterparts, were active participants in the system of genocide, and that they were not merely victims of circumstance. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and the testimonies of survivors painted a clear picture of the brutality they inflicted. What's particularly striking about the trials of these women is how little remorse many of them showed. While some expressed regret, others remained defiant, insisting that they had simply been doing their jobs. In fact, a number of them even attempted to justify their actions by claiming they were powerless to resist the commands of their Nazi superiors. This defense was often used by many of the accused at the Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crime trials across Europe. However, as the trials proceeded, it became increasingly clear that this excuse would not suffice. The belief in the concept of just following orders is something that continues to be a topic of debate in the aftermath of these trials. While it is clear that the Nazi regime was a totalitarian state where obedience to authority was strongly encouraged, it is equally clear that many of the female guards at Stutthof had the opportunity to make different choices. They could have refused to participate in the violence. They could have spoken out against the injustice they witnessed. But instead, many chose to carry out the orders without hesitation, driven by their own hatred, fear, or blind loyalty to the regime. As the years passed, the memories of these women remained etched in the minds of survivors. The trials that followed the war were a way of ensuring that the atrocities committed during the Holocaust were never forgotten. They were not only about bringing the guilty to justice, but also about reminding the world that evil can take many forms, even in the guise of ordinary women. These women were not different from the other perpetrators of the Holocaust. They were active participants in the genocide that claimed the lives of millions. Their eventual punishment, in the form of prison sentences or executions, was not a matter of vengeance, but of justice. The consequences of their actions were severe, but they were also necessary. The executions of the female guards at Stutthof sent a clear message. No one, regardless of their gender, was beyond the reach of justice. The Holocaust was a collective crime, and those who were responsible for the suffering and deaths of millions would not escape accountability. Even though many of these women tried to flee or hide, they could not outrun the truth of what they had done. The trials that followed were a painful but essential part of the healing process of the victims, and they serve as a stark reminder that justice would be served, no matter how long it took. The brutal executions of female guards at Stutthof are a powerful, yet tragic reminder of the depths of human cruelty and the consequences of unchecked power. These women, who once held life and death in their hands, ultimately became symbols of justice for the countless innocent lives they helped destroy. While we cannot undo the horrors they caused, the reckoning they faced in the post-war years represents an essential chapter in the pursuit of justice and accountability for the atrocities of the Holocaust. What stands out about the story of the female guards at Stutthof is not just the brutality they inflicted, but the chilling fact that many of them were able to carry out such violence without remorse or empathy. Their involvement in the suffering of prisoners was not a passive act. They participated willingly, often with a zeal that made them some of the most feared figures in the camp. They were not just obeying orders. They were actively engaged in an evil system, doing everything in their power to uphold it, to control the lives of those trapped in the camp. Their roles were not just limited to overseeing labor or administering punishments. They were directly involved in the executions of countless prisoners. The cruelty they exhibited was far more than the standard abuse one might expect in a system designed to dehumanize its victims. These women crossed a line into sadism, taking pleasure in the suffering they caused. They were part of a network of terror that destroyed families, cultures, and entire communities. Their actions, as part of a genocidal ideology, helped fuel one of the most horrific events in human history. When the war ended and the true scale of Nazi atrocities was revealed to the world, the trials that followed aimed to bring the perpetrators to justice. The female guards of Stutthof were not spared from facing the consequences of their actions. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent war crimes trials sought to hold all those responsible for these crimes accountable, men and women alike. Some tried to claim that they were simply following orders, but that defense was rightfully rejected by the courts. The fact remains that these women, along with the men who commanded them, were active participants in the Holocaust, and their accountability was a necessary part of the healing process for the victims and for humanity as a whole. Their executions were not just an act of punishment. They were a symbol of justice. The message was clear. No one is above the law, no matter how much power or authority they once held. The trials serve as a reminder that crimes against humanity, no matter how long ago they were committed, cannot be allowed to go unpunished. And for the survivors and the families of the victims, seeing these perpetrators face justice provided a sense of closure, a small victory over the overwhelming evil they had endured. However, justice is not only about punishment. It is about remembrance. The brutal executions of the female guards at Stutthof must never be forgotten, because they represent more than the personal fates of those women. They represent the larger, systemic evil of the Nazi regime. Remembering these events is a vital part of ensuring that history does not repeat itself. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust are passed down through generations, so that we never forget the atrocities that occurred and work to prevent such horrors from happening again. The memory of the Holocaust, the suffering of those who were persecuted, tortured, and murdered, is a powerful tool in the fight against hatred, prejudice, and violence. But it is also a solemn duty. We must never allow the memories of the victims to fade into the background. The female guard at Stutthof were part of a network of terror that caused immense suffering, but their story must also be a warning that evil can take many forms, and it can come from unexpected places. While we must never lose sight of the horrifying crimes committed, we also must remember the importance of justice. The fact that these women were tried and executed is a testament to the fact that accountability matters, and even the most powerful and feared perpetrators can and must be held to account for their actions. In the end, justice was served, but the wounds of the Holocaust continue to run deep, reminding us that we must remain vigilant in ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. So, as we reflect on the brutal executions of the female guards at Stutthof, let us honor the victims by carrying their stories forward. Let us commit to keeping their memories alive, ensuring that the history of the Holocaust is never forgotten, and let us remain steadfast in our dedication to fighting injustice wherever it may arise, so that the horrors of the past are never repeated in the future. If you found this video thought-provoking, please like, share, and subscribe. By sharing these stories and educating others, we help keep the memory of the Holocaust alive and ensure that the lessons we've learned will shape a more just and compassionate world. Together, we can honor the past and build a better future, one where hatred and cruelty have no place to take root.